The cold night air was a blade in her lungs. Each ragged breath burned, a counterpoint to the fire in her legs and the sharp, throbbing pain above her eye. Streetlights smeared past in streaks of orange and white, a watery blur seen through unshed tears. Elena Vance ran. She did not know where she was going, only what she was running from. The sound of his voice, a thick and furious roar, echoed 2 streets behind her, chasing her down. It was a sound that had haunted her entire life, the soundtrack to her fear. But tonight it was different. Tonight it was the sound of an ending. Her bare feet slapped against the wet pavement, the grit and grime of the city clinging to her skin. She had lost a shoe somewhere back there, in the chaos of scrambling out of the apartment window and dropping 2 stories into the overgrown bushes behind the building. The branches had scratched her arms and face, but the fall had been blessedly soft. Softer than his hand. Anything was softer than his hand. A thin trickle of blood, or starring, traced a path from her hairline down her temple. She swiped at it, her fingers coming away dark. The metallic scent filled her senses, mingling with the city's perfume of exhaust fumes and damp decay. Every shadow seemed to lunge at her. Every distant shout made her heart seize in her chest. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The street was empty for a moment, but she knew he was coming. Richard Vance did not give up when he felt he was owed something, and he believed he was owed her. His property, his ticket out of the hole he had dug for himself. He had screamed it at her, his face purple with rage, his breath sour with whiskey. He had a debt to pay, and she was the currency. Her lungs were screaming for rest. A stitch of pure agony flared in her side. She couldn't stop. To stop was to be caught, and to be caught was a fate she could no longer bear to imagine. Her eyes darted around, searching for a refuge, any dark corner to disappear into. Ahead, between a derelict laundromat and a boarded-up butcher shop, was a sliver of perfect blackness. Blackwood Alley. It was narrow, foreboding, and smelled of stale water and garbage. It looked like the kind of place where hope went to die. It was perfect. Without a second thought, she veered sharply, plunging into the darkness. The sudden absence of streetlights was disorienting. The only illumination came from a single, sputtering neon sign from a bar at the far end, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced like demons on the damp brick walls. The ground was slick with something foul. Her foot slid, and she pinwheeled her arms, fighting for balance. Her frantic momentum carried her forward, deeper into the alley's throat, and then she hit it. Or rather, him. It was like running into a wall made of stone. The impact knocked the last of the air from her body with a choked gasp. She was thrown backward, but a strong hand shot out and clamped around her upper arm, steadying her before she could fall. For a dizzying second, the world was just a confusing swirl of sensations. The scent of expensive wool, clean linen, and something else. Something cool and metallic like winter air. The solid, unyielding muscle beneath a perfectly tailored suit. The shocking warmth of his hand on her cold skin. She looked up, her vision swimming. He was tall, impossibly so from her position. His face was a study in sharp angles and severe control, framed by the dim, flickering light. He had intense, piercing gray eyes that seemed to see right through her terror to the frantic, desperate creature beneath. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, the only mar on an otherwise flawless, intimidating canvas. He was not alone. 2 other men dressed in similar dark, expensive suits stood just behind him like loyal shadows. They were observing a transaction, their faces impassive until she had literally crashed into their world. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over her. She had run from one monster straight into the den of others. These were not ordinary men. They moved with a stillness, a predatory grace that spoke of contained power and effortless danger. One of them, a man with watchful, intelligent eyes, took a step forward, his expression hardening with suspicion. "Boss," he said, his voice a low murmur. But Elena did not hear him. All she could see was the face of the man holding her arm. He was looking down at her, his expression unreadable. There was no pity in his eyes, but there was no immediate threat either. Just a quiet, unnerving assessment. It was in that split second, with the sound of her father's distant shouting growing closer, that her instinct for survival did something strange. It did not tell her to run again. It told her to cling. Her free hand, shaking uncontrollably, came up and fisted into the lapel of his black suit jacket. The material was impossibly smooth, a world away from the filth of the alley. Her knuckles were white. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest through the fabric. Her entire body was trembling, a leaf in a hurricane. "Please," she whispered, the word a raw, broken thing torn from her throat. Her eyes, wide and pleading, locked with his. She saw a flicker of something in their gray depths. Surprise? Annoyance? She couldn't tell. She only knew this was her last chance, the only chance she had left. "Hold me," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please, just hold me." It was the plea of a terrified child, a desperate prayer to an unknown God. She was asking for protection from a man who was the very personification of danger. It made no sense, but her soul was screaming. And this was the only anchor it could find in a world that was trying to tear her apart. Just as the words left her lips, a heavy, stumbling figure appeared at the entrance to the alley, silhouetted against the hazy glow of the street. Richard Vance. He swayed on his feet, his face flushed and contorted with fury. "There you are," he snarled, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "You think you can run from me? You worthless little—" His words died in his throat as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. He saw her, and then he saw the man she was clinging to, and the other men standing like sentinels in the shadows. His drunken bravado wavered, but his entitlement won out. "Get your hands off my daughter," he spat, taking a clumsy step forward. "She's coming with me." The man with the watchful eyes, Leo, moved instantly. His hand went to Elena's shoulder, his grip firm, ready to peel her off his boss and dispose of the problem. "Ma'am, you need to let go," he said, his tone clipped and professional, leaving no room for argument. Elena flinched, a sob catching in her throat. It was over. They were going to hand her back to him. The tiny, fragile spark of hope that had ignited in her hard chest was extinguished, leaving only cold, familiar dread. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the shove, for her father's rough hands to grab her again. But it never came. Instead, a quiet authority filled the space. The man she was holding, the man they called boss, lifted his free hand. It was not a grand gesture, just a slight, deliberate movement. But it was enough. Leo's hand froze an inch from her shoulder. He and the other man went perfectly still, their professional calm replaced by a flicker of stunned confusion. The entire alley seemed to hold its breath. The man's gray eyes never left Richard. They were flat, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. He was looking at her father not as a person, but as an obstacle, a piece of filth to be swept from his path. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that was more shocking than any sudden violence, he moved. He took a step back, pulling her with him. His arm, the one that had been gripping her, slid around her back, drawing her out of the way. He positioned his body fully in front of hers, shielding her completely. Elena found herself pressed against his back, her face buried in the cool, clean fabric of his suit. She could feel the solid wall of his muscles, could hear the steady, unhurried beat of his heart against her cheek. He stood between her and her father. He stood between her and the world. From behind him, she heard his voice. It was not loud. It was a low, measured sound, as quiet and as final as a closing tomb. "She's with me." The words hung in the damp air, an undeniable declaration. Richard stopped his advance, confusion warring with anger on his bloated face. "What? Who the hell do you think you are? That's my daughter." There was a beat of silence. It stretched on, thick with unspoken threat. Elena could feel the tension in the body of the man protecting her, a stillness that was more menacing than any shout. When he spoke again, his voice was even quieter, laced with a chilling finality that cut through the night. "Touch her," Julian Thorne said, "and you're dead." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. A promise. The air in the alley turned to ice. Richard Vance, for all his bluster and drunken rage, was fundamentally a coward. He preyed on the weak, on those he knew could not fight back. But the man standing before him now was not weak. He was something else entirely, something ancient and predatory. Richard saw the two other men, their hands now subtly positioned inside their jackets. He saw the absolute certainty in the tall stranger's eyes. He saw his own death looking back at him. His face paled. The fury drained away, replaced by a pathetic, animal fear. He took one stumbling step backward, then another. He mumbled something incoherent, a broken piece of a curse. He turned and practically scrambled out of the alley, his heavy footsteps retreating rapidly down the street until they were swallowed by the city's noise. He vanished into the shadows from which he had come. The alley was silent again. The only sounds were the distant wail of a siren, the hum of the dying neon sign, and Elena's own ragged, shuddering breaths. The man in front of her did not move for a long moment. She could feel the coiled tension in his shoulders slowly begin to recede. His men, Leo and the other, were statues carved from disbelief. They stared at their boss, their faces a mixture of shock and profound confusion. They had just witnessed Julian Thorne, a man who had built his empire on a foundation of ruthless logic and emotional detachment, a man who lived by the code that personal attachments were a fatal weakness, break his own most sacred rule. For a bleeding, terrified girl he had never seen before. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Julian turned. Elena instinctively shrank back, her hand still clutching his jacket like a lifeline. He was no longer looking past her at a threat. He was looking at her. His gray eyes, intense and unreadable, met her terrified hazel ones. The protector had dealt with the monster. Now she was alone in the dark with him, and she had no idea if she had just been saved or simply claimed by a more powerful one. The world had shrunk to the space between heartbeats. One moment, the damp chill of the alley. The next, the impossible warmth of his back shielding her. Julian Thorne turned, his face an unreadable mask of shadows and sharp angles. The men who flanked him, who had looked ready to discard her like trash, were now perfectly still. They stared, not at her, but at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and disciplined obedience. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Elena's own breath was a ragged, painful thing in her chest. Every nerve ending screamed. She expected him to push her away now that the immediate threat was gone. She expected him to look at her with disgust, to hand her over to one of his men. Instead, his gray eyes met hers, and they were like chips of stone, hard and ancient. There was no softness in them, no kindness. There was only an unnerving intensity, a gaze that seemed to strip away the grime and the terror and see the frantic, desperate thing hiding underneath. A large hand settled on the small of her back. It was not gentle. It was firm, possessive, a gesture of command. It propelled her forward, away from the mouth of the alley, and toward a long black car that idled silently at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the city's indifferent lights. One of his men opened the rear door. The interior was a cavern of black leather and smelled faintly of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic and clean. Julian guided her inside, his touch never leaving her back until she was seated. She scrambled across the cold leather, pressing herself against the far door as if she could melt through it. He slid in after her, and the door closed with a heavy, final thud. It sealed them in a capsule of profound silence. The driver did not turn. The man in the passenger seat did not speak. They were simply extensions of the car, of him. The car pulled away from the curb with a smooth, powerful glide. Elena stared out the window, watching the blur of streetlights and neon signs paint fleeting streaks across her vision. Her body had begun to tremble violently, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that started in her bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, digging her fingers into her own bruised skin. She felt his gaze on her but could not bring herself to look at him. To look at him was to acknowledge that this was real, that she had run from one monster and thrown herself at the mercy of another. He said nothing for the entire journey. The silence was more terrifying than any threat. It was a weighted silence, full of power and decisions being made that she would have no part in. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, trying to slow the frantic hammering in her chest. Each inhale was a gasp, each exhale a sob she swallowed down. She could still feel the phantom grip of her father's fingers on her arm, could still hear his slurred, angry voice. The car descended into an underground garage, the hum of the engine echoing off concrete walls. It stopped in a reserved space, starkly lit by fluorescent tubes. Julian got out first, For a terrifying second, Elena thought he would just leave her there. But the door on her side opened, and he was waiting. He did not offer a hand. He simply stood there, an immovable object, his expectation as clear as a spoken command. Trembling, she slid out of the car. He led her to a private elevator. The doors were brushed steel, and they opened without a sound. Inside, he pressed the highest button, the one marked with a simple P. The ascent was fast and silent, her ears popping with the change in pressure. It felt like leaving the world behind, rising into a place where the normal rules of life did not apply. The elevator doors opened directly into a living space, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was not a room. It was a landscape. An immense, sprawling area of polished concrete floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around two entire walls. The city lay spread out below them, a breathtaking tapestry of glittering lights and dark canyons. The furniture was sparse, modern, and severe. A black leather sofa, a glass table, a few stark pieces of art that offered no comfort. The air was cool and still, smelling of nothing at all, a sterile, controlled environment. A woman appeared from a hallway. She was older, with her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, wearing a simple dark dress. Her face was calm, her expression neutral as she looked first at Julian, then at Elena. She took in Elena's torn clothing, the blood on her sleeve, the wild terror in her eyes, and not a flicker of surprise crossed her features. Julian spoke, his voice the first sound to break the penthouse's oppressive silence. It was low and measured. "Mrs. Gable, our guest will be staying in the East Suite. She requires some attention." Mrs. Gable nodded once. "Of course, Mr. Thorne." She turned to Elena, and her eyes, though professional, held a trace of something that might have been pity. "This way, miss." Elena stood frozen. Her feet felt welded to the floor. To follow the woman was to accept this, to walk deeper into the gilded cage. But to stay was to remain under Julian's direct, unnerving gaze. She chose the lesser of two terrors and followed Mrs. Gable, her movements stiff and jerky, like a puppet with tangled strings. The housekeeper led her down a long, white hallway that felt like a corridor in a hospital or a museum. She opened a door into a bedroom that was larger than any room Elena had ever lived in. A king-size bed, covered in a pristine white duvet, sat into the center. Like the main room, one entire wall was a sheet of glass looking out onto the city. "There is a bathroom through there," Mrs. Gable said, gesturing to a sliding door. "Please allow me to help you with your injuries." Elena was guided into a bathroom of white marble and gleaming chrome fixtures. The reflection that met her in the vast mirror was a stranger's, a gaunt, pale girl with huge, haunted eyes. A dark, ugly bruise was beginning to bloom along her jaw, and a small, crusted cut marred her cheekbone. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her shirt was stained. Wordlessly, Mrs. Gable took Elena's torn jacket and laid it carefully over a stool. Her touch was light and impersonal as she examined the scrape on Elena's forearm where she had hit the pavement. Elena flinched, not from pain, but from the simple act of being touched. "I need to clean this," the housekeeper said softly. She moved with an unhurried efficiency, gathering a first aid kit from a cabinet. She soaked a cotton pad in antiseptic, her movements practiced and sure. "This may sting a little." The sharp, cold bite of the liquid was a grounding sensation. It was real. This pain was real. Elena focused on it, on the slight pressure of Mrs. Gable's fingers. The woman worked in silence, cleaning the cut on her cheek, applying a small bandage to her arm. She offered Elena a glass of water, and Elena's hand shook so badly she had to grip it with both hands to bring it to her lips. The cool water was a relief to her raw throat. When the housekeeper was finished, she gathered the used supplies. "There are clothes in the closet. They should fit. If you require anything else, you need only ask." Her voice was a monotone, trained to betray nothing. With a final, brief nod, she slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. Elena was left alone in the echoing silence of the suite. She stood in the middle of the opulent bathroom, listening to the frantic beat of her own heart. She felt like an animal caught in a trap, a stray, brought into a place it did not belong. This cleanliness, this order, this cold perfection, it was all wrong. It felt more dangerous than the open violence she had fled. A low murmur of voices drifted from the main room. The bedroom door was not fully closed. Drawn by a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to understand what was happening to her, Elena crept towards it. She pressed her ear to the narrow gap. Her breath held tight in her lungs. She recognized Julian's low, resonant tone, but it was the other voice that caught her attention. It was sharp, clipped, and urgent. "This is a mistake, Julian. A catastrophic one." Elena recognized the speaker as the man who had been in the passenger seat of the car, the one who stood closest to Julian in the alley. His name, she would learn, was Leo Sterling. "You brought a stray into the heart of the operation. We know nothing about her, who she is, what she's running from. For all we know, this is a setup." There was a pause. Elena could picture Julian standing by the window, looking down at his city. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. She was bleeding and terrified. Her father was going to harm her. Her father. Leo's voice was laced with disbelief. A drunkard stumbling out of a bar. "We deal with killers, with entire organizations that want you dead. And you risk everything for a girl you found in an alley. Think about what this looks like." The men saw it. They saw you. For the first time, they saw an emotional impulse. They saw a crack in the armor. Elena's blood ran cold. A crack in the armor. That's what she was. Not a person. A liability. Marcus Gallo would pay a king's ransom for a weakness like this. Leo pressed on, his voice dropping lower, more intense. "He's been trying to find a way inside for years. A way to get to you. And you just opened the front door and invited it in. She is a vulnerability we cannot afford. You have upheld the family code your entire life. No attachments, no weaknesses. Your father and brother died because they forgot that rule." The mention of his family hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Elena squeezed her eyes shut. She felt a wave of nausea. This was so much worse than she could have imagined. She hadn't just stumbled into a rich man's protection. She had fallen into the middle of a war, and she was being identified as the enemy's newest potential weapon. "I made a decision, Leo." Julian's voice was flat, cutting off any further argument. "She stays. She is under my protection. That is the end of it. Ensure the building is on lockdown. Double the perimeter security. No one gets in or out without my direct authorization." "And her?" Leo asked. "What is she? A prisoner?" "She is a guest," Julian replied, his tone leaving no room for debate. But the words sounded hollow, a lie even to Elena's ears. The conversation was over. Elena heard footsteps, the soft click of a door closing somewhere down the hall. She scrambled back from her own door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a weakness, a vulnerability, a thing to be managed, locked down, and secured. She had not escaped her father's poison. She had only been moved to a larger, more opulent one, guarded by a man far more powerful and infinitely more dangerous. Panic began to bubble up, hot and acidic. She needed to ground herself, to find something real in this sterile, terrifying place. Her eyes fell on the torn jacket the housekeeper had left on the stool. Her father had grabbed it when she'd pulled away. He had ripped the fabric. Her hands flew to her neck. The thin silver chain she always wore was gone. A fresh wave of despair washed over her. It couldn't be gone. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. A desperate, frantic energy seized her. She grabbed the jacket, her fingers plunging into the pockets, searching. Nothing. She threw it to the floor and fell to her knees, shaking the garment. A small, metallic glint caught her eye. Lying on the pristine white tile of the bathroom floor was the medallion, a small, worn silver disc. The chain had snapped, but the pendant itself was safe. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back finally spilled over, hot and silent. With a trembling hand, she picked it up. It was cool against her feverish skin. She curled her fingers around the St. Christopher's medallion, the raised image of the saint carrying the child worn smooth from years of her own anxious touch. Her mother had given it to her just before she died. "He will keep you safe on your journey," she had whispered. Elena clutched it like a lifeline, the metal edges digging into her palm. It was a tiny piece of her past, a tangible link to the only unconditional love she had ever known. In this cold, vast penthouse, surrounded by unspoken threats and the politics of violence, it was the only thing that was truly hers. It was an anchor in a storm that was just beginning. She rose to her feet, the medallion held tight in her fist. She walked out of the bathroom and into the cavernous bedroom. The silence was absolute. She was completely, utterly alone. She drifted toward the massive wall of glass drawn to the spectacle of the city below. From this height, the world was an abstract pattern of light and shadow. The endless river of headlights, the jeweled glow of office towers, the distant, silent pulse of a metropolis that had no idea she even existed. It was beautiful. So beautiful it hurt to look at. A beauty that felt alien and hostile. She saw her own reflection in the dark glass, a ghostly figure suspended over the abyss. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark with a fear that was slowly hardening into something else, something colder. Her bruised jaw was a stark reminder of the world she had fled. The glittering city spread before her was the world she had fallen into. She was no safer here. She knew that now. She had heard it in Leo's voice. She was a pawn, a liability, a beautiful, fragile object brought into a fortress, and her presence made the walls weaker. Alone in the vast, empty room, Elena looked at her bruised reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window. The entire city glittered below her like a beautiful, dangerous trap, and she was the bait. Sleep was a country she could no longer visit. Elena stood before the vast expanse of glass, her forehead pressed against its cool surface. The city below was a sprawling galaxy of silent, indifferent lights. Each one represented a life, a home, a place she could not go. Here, in this silent palace of steel and glass, she was as isolated as a star. The borrowed silk robe felt alien against her skin, a soft cage. She could still feel the phantom grip of her father's hands on her arms, still hear the echo of her own ragged breathing in that dark alley. Had it only been hours ago? It felt like a lifetime. She was looking at her own reflection, a pale ghost superimposed over the glittering skyline. Her eyes were too wide, her face bruised and haunted. She saw a girl trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket that muffled the world. It was a sound all its own. Then a soft click broke the stillness. Elena tensed, her muscles locking as if preparing for a blow. She didn't turn. She watched in the reflection as a tall figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway. Julian Thorne. He moved without a sound, a predator in his own domain. He wore dark trousers and a simple gray shirt that clung to the powerful lines of his shoulders and chest. Without the armor of his suit jacket, he seemed somehow more dangerous, more real. He stopped several feet behind her, his presence a weight in the room. Elena held her breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was a mouse, and the hawk had just entered the room. Her mind raced, replaying the argument she had overheard. A liability, a mistake. Was he here to fix his mistake? He said nothing. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, threatening to snap. Elena kept her eyes fixed on his reflection in the window. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, his gray eyes narrowed. She could feel his gaze like a physical touch, examining her, assessing her. Was he seeing the girl from the alley, or the problem his man Leo had spoken of? She forced herself to remain still, to show no fear, though every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide. But there was nowhere to go. This room, this building was the edge of her world now. He finally moved, not toward her, but away, toward the minimalist kitchen area that was part of the massive open space. She heard the quiet sound of a cupboard opening, the gentle clink of glass. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, the knuckles white. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to curdle into something else. It always did. He returned, holding a glass of water. He stopped a careful distance away and placed it on a low table beside a severe-looking leather sofa. He still hadn't spoken a single word. His movements were deliberate, economical. Nothing was wasted. He looked at her again, his gaze dropping to the side of her face. A flicker of something crossed his features, too quick to name. Then he turned and disappeared back down the hallway he had come from. Elena's breath escaped in a shaky sigh. She stared at the glass of water. It was a simple offering, yet it felt like a test she didn't understand. Her throat was painfully dry, but she couldn't bring herself to move toward it. It felt like accepting a contract, like taking a step deeper into his world. She remained frozen, a statue of fear, watching the empty space where he had been. When he came back, he was carrying a small black box, a first aid kit. He opened it on the same table, the contents neat and organized. Antiseptic wipes, bandages, sterile cotton. He picked up a small packet, tearing it open with his long, deft fingers. He soaked a piece of cotton, his focus absolute. And then he took a step toward her. Elena flinched, a small, involuntary jerk of her body, and took a half step back. Her shoulder blades hit the cold glass of the window. Trapped, his eyes met hers. He stopped instantly. He held up his hands, one of them holding the small, wet piece of cotton. The gesture was clear. He was not going to hurt her. But she had been taught that lesson before, taught that hands that offered comfort could also bring pain. He spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the quiet air. "You have a cut on your cheek." It was not a question, it was a simple statement of fact. He waited, letting her decide. He did not command her to come closer. He did not assert his authority. He simply stood there, offering a choice. Elena's heart was a chaotic mess. This man had claimed her in an alley, his voice laced with deadly promise. He had brought her to this place, a gilded cage high above the world. He was the source of her terror and her only shield against it. Her mind screamed at her to stay away, to not let him touch her. But something in his stillness, in the quiet patience in his eyes, held her rooted to the spot. Slowly, hesitantly, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Julian moved closer so slowly she could have backed away at any moment. He didn't crowd her. He stopped just within reach, his height creating a shadow that fell over her. He smelled of soap and clean linen, a scent that was jarringly domestic in a man who radiated such power. He raised his hand, and she fought the urge to squeeze her eyes shut. But she didn't. She watched him. She needed to see it coming. His left hand came up, not to grab her, but to gently cup her jaw, his thumb resting just below her ear. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly light. It was a gesture of steadying, not of control. Then, with his right hand, he brought the cotton to her cheek. The antiseptic was cold, and it stung for a second, a sharp, clean pain. She winced and his thumb stroked her skin once, a brief, soothing motion. He dabbed at the small cut with an incredible gentleness. It was a level of care she had not experienced in years, if ever. She found herself staring at the faint scar that cut through his eyebrow, at the intense concentration in his features. His focus was entirely on the small task, on this tiny injury. It was as if nothing else in the world existed. She could feel the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing. For the first time since she'd crashed into him, her own frantic heartbeat began to slow, to match his. He was so close she could see the flecks of charcoal and storm cloud in his gray eyes. This was not the man who had faced down her father with cold fury. This was someone else entirely, a man who tended to a small wound as if it were the most important thing in his world. When he was done, he didn't pull away immediately. His hand remained cupping her jaw. His gaze lifted from her cheek to meet her eyes. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken questions. He was looking at her, really looking, as if trying to piece together the puzzle she presented. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was softer now, stripped of the command it had carried in the alley. It was just a question, from one person to another, in a quiet room late at night. The sound of her own name felt foreign on her tongue. She had been a possession, a problem, a target for so long. She had forgotten what it was to simply be a person. "Elena," she whispered. The word was barely audible, rusty from disuse. He watched her lips form the name. "Elena," he repeated, his voice just as quiet. He said it not like a question, but like a discovery, like he was filing it away somewhere important. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The city lights blurred into a soft watercolor painting behind him. There was only the warmth of his hand on her skin, the intensity of his gaze, and her name hanging in the air between them. It was the first crack in the armor he wore and the first terrifying seed of trust in her heart. Miles away, in a dingy, smoke-filled room that smelled of defeat and cheap whiskey, Richard Vance clutched a phone to his ear. The receiver was slick with his sweat. He paced the small space, his steps unsteady, his world reduced to the outcome of this single call. The television flickered in the corner, its sound muted, casting erratic blue shadows on the peeling wallpaper. He had lost everything. His pathetic attempts at gambling had led him straight to Marcus Gallo, a man who did not forgive debts. Richard had offered money he didn't have, made promises he couldn't keep, and tonight he had lost the one thing he still had left to bargain with. He had lost his daughter. He had watched her run into the arms of Julian Thorne, Gallo's most hated rival. And in that moment of blind panic, a desperate, ugly idea had formed in his mind. A smooth, cold voice finally answered on the other end. Gallo. There was no greeting, just a clipped, impatient name. Richard flinched, his bravado evaporating like mist. Marcus, it's me. It's Richard Vance. He cringed at the sound of his own whining tone. I have something for you. Something you want. There was a pause on the other end, filled with dismissive silence. Richard could picture Gallo on the other end, sitting in some expensive restaurant, swirling a glass of wine, utterly unimpressed. You have nothing I want, Richard, Gallo said, his voice dripping with condescension, except the money you owe me, and my patience for that is gone. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. No, wait, it's about Thorne, he said, the words rushing out of him. Julian Thorne, I know where he is, and I know who he's with. This time the silence was different. It was attentive, predatory. Go on, Gallo said, a new edge to his voice. My daughter, Richard stammered, shame and desperation warring within him. She ran from me tonight. She ran right to him. He took her. I saw it with my own eyes. He has her with him now, in his building. The Thorne Tower. He waited. His breath held. He was selling his own child. He knew it. But the image of Gallo's enforcers, their cold eyes and heavy fists, was more immediate, more terrifying than a father's conscience. He just took her? Gallo asked, a note of dark amusement in his voice. A random girl off the street? That doesn't sound like Julian. He's disciplined. He doesn't make mistakes. She was desperate, Richard explained, trying to make it sound like a valuable piece of intelligence. Bleeding, scared. He took her in. He protected her from me. He claimed her, right in front of his men. I think he sees something in her. A low chuckle came through the phone. It was a chilling sound. Well, well, Richard, perhaps you are not as useless as you look. Marcus Gallo leaned back in his leather chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Julian Thorne, the untouchable ghost of the city, had a weakness. A sudden, inexplicable, human weakness. It was the crack in the fortress Gallo had been searching for years. You tell me exactly where this happened, Gallo said, his voice now dangerously smooth. And you tell me what she looks like. And maybe, just maybe, we can forget about your debt. Richard began to babble, describing the alley, describing Elena, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to please, to save himself. He didn't think about his daughter. He didn't think about the man whose touch was so gentle. He only thought about the crushing weight of his own failures and the one person he could sacrifice to escape them. Back in the penthouse, the moment had passed. Julian slowly withdrew his hand. The absence of his warmth was a sudden cold shock. He disposed of the used cotton and closed the first aid kit with a quiet snap. He looked at Elena one last time, his face once again an unreadable mask. Get some rest, he said, his voice back to its usual commanding tone. It was an order, not a suggestion. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the long hallway, leaving her alone with the glass of water and the lingering feeling of his touch on her skin. Elena finally moved. She walked to the table and picked up the glass, her fingers trembling slightly. The water was cool against her lips. It was just water, but it felt like acceptance. It felt like a choice. She sat on the edge of the sofa, clutching the cold glass, and stared out at the city that no longer seemed quite so alien. She was still a prisoner, but for a fleeting moment, she had been seen as a person. Across the city, Marcus Gallo hung up the phone. He stared at the wall for a long moment, the gears turning in his sharp mind. Julian Thorne, the man who had walled himself off from the world after the fall of his father and brother, had opened a door, and a frightened little girl had just walked through it. He picked up another phone, one reserved for specific business. "Get a team on the Thorne Tower," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I want eyes on every entrance, and I want a long lens on the penthouse. Vance's daughter is in there. I want to know every time she breathes. I want to know every time Thorne looks at her." He paused, a cruel smile touching his lips. "Find her and get me a picture." In a darkened apartment in a nondescript building across from the Thorne Tower, a man assembled a rifle. But he didn't attach a scope for firing. He attached a powerful camera with a telephoto lens. He was a specialist, an observer. He set up his tripod on the balcony, the cold night air biting at his exposed skin. He adjusted the focus, the state-of-the-art optics cutting through the darkness, through the rain-streaked air, bringing the top floor of the opposite skyscraper into sharp relief. He scanned the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, searching. Most were dark, but one was illuminated, a single rectangle of light against the black sky. And inside, there was movement. He fine-tuned the lens, the image swimming into perfect clarity. He saw a young woman with long, dark hair. She was standing in the middle of the vast room, looking small and lost. Then a figure entered the frame. Tall, imposing. Julian Thorne. The man's finger rested on the shutter button. He watched as Thorne approached the girl. He saw them talking, though he could not hear the words. He saw Thorne raise a hand to her face. He zoomed in closer, the lens capturing the surprising intimacy of the gesture. He saw the way Thorne stood near her, a silent protector. It was exactly what Gallo had wanted, a connection, a weakness. He pressed the button. The camera made a soft, mechanical click, capturing the image. A moment of unexpected, fragile care frozen in time. An image that would be interpreted as possession, as leverage, as the beginning of the end for Julian Thorne. The sniper lowered the camera, looked at the digital screen, and knew he had just captured the perfect shot. The silence of the penthouse was a living thing. It had a weight and a texture, pressing in on Elena from all sides. For 3 days, she had moved through the vast, empty rooms like a ghost, haunting a life that was not her own. The floors were cool and polished, reflecting a distorted version of herself she no longer recognized. The air smelled of nothing, a sterile, clean scent that was somehow more unsettling than the grime of the alley she had fled. Safety had a pillow, and that price was the world. From the floor to ceiling windows, the city sprawled below, a web of glittering lights and endless movement. But it was a city under glass, a beautiful painting she could see but never touch. She was a well-cared-for prisoner. A quiet, older woman named Mrs. Gable brought her meals on a tray, her expression professionally kind but unreadable. She was given soft clothes that felt alien against her skin, fabrics that held no memories. Julian Thorne was a phantom in his own home. She would hear the distant, quiet click of a door, or catch a glimpse of his dark suit disappearing around a corner. He was an absence that was more powerful than any presence. The night he had cleaned the cut on her cheek felt like a dream, a strange, impossible moment of gentleness from a man who radiated absolute danger. Since then, he had kept his distance, leaving her to the suffocating quiet of his sky-high fortress. Elena found herself pacing the length of the main living area, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete, back and forth, like a caged animal. She could feel his eyes on her, even when he wasn't there. She was an object he had acquired, a problem he was managing. The thought made a familiar cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had spent her entire life as someone else's property, a thing to be used or discarded. She had run from her father only to land in the hands of a man whose power was 1,000 times more terrifying. She stopped in front of the window, pressing her forehead against the cool, armored glass. She wasn't sure what was worse, the fear of being hurt or the fear of being forgotten. Here she was simply contained. Her gaze fell upon a couple walking on the street far below, their heads close together, their hands linked. A sharp, painful longing pierced through her. To walk freely, to feel the sun on her skin, to not be afraid. The silence behind her shifted, and she knew without turning that he had entered the room. Her entire body went rigid. Julian watched her for a long moment. He had seen her pacing. He saw the way she stared out the window, her posture a study in desperate stillness. He had provided her with sanctuary, with the finest food, with medical care. He had removed the immediate threat of her father, but he had not given her peace. He had only replaced one cage with another, more luxurious one. The sight of her so small and lost in the cavernous space he called home stirred something uncomfortable within him. It was an echo of Leo's warning, a liability, an emotional variable in a world that ran on cold, hard logic. And yet, he could not bring himself to send her away. He walked towards her, his expensive shoes making no sound. She did not turn, but he saw her spine stiffen even more. She was like a deer that had scented a wolf. "Come with me," he said. His voice was low, cutting through the silence without disturbing it. It wasn't a question. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She turned slowly, her eyes wide and questioning. He was standing several feet away, his hands in the pockets of his tailored trousers. His expression was, as always, impossible to read. His gray eyes were like chips of stone. She swallowed, her throat dry. Where? What did he want? Her mind raced through a dozen terrible possibilities. Was this it? Was he finally tired of her presence? Was he sending her back? He gave a slight, impatient tilt of his head, gesturing for her to follow. Without another word, he turned and walked toward a section of the penthouse she had not explored, a blank wall of dark wood paneling near the private elevator. She hesitated for only a second. Disobeying him felt more dangerous than following. Her feet, numb with apprehension, carried her after him. He pressed a nearly invisible seam in the wood, and a door slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing not a room, but a small, stark elevator. He stepped inside and waited. The space was barely big enough for two people. Elena's breath caught in her chest as she stepped in beside him, careful not to brush against him. The air grew thick, charged with his proximity. He smelled of expensive cologne and something else, something clean and sharp, like winter air. The elevator ascended smoothly, silently. It was a short ride, maybe only 2 floors up. When the doors opened again, Elena forgot how to breathe. She was standing on the threshold of another world. Before her was a garden, a real living garden, tucked away on the roof of the skyscraper, hidden from the city below by high stone walls. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, of lavender and something sweet and spicy she couldn't name. A small, simple fountain trickled in the center, the sound of the water a gentle melody that instantly soothed the frayed edges of her nerves. There were carefully tended beds of white and purple flowers, slender green stalks of ornamental grasses that swayed in the light breeze, and even a small, gnarled olive tree growing in a massive stone pot. It was an oasis of impossible life, suspended between the concrete of the building and the endless sky. After days of sterile gray and black, the sudden, vibrant green felt like a physical shock. She took a tentative step out of the elevator and onto a path of smooth gray flagstones. Julian watched the transformation on her face. He saw the fear in her eyes soften, replaced by a dawning wonder. He saw the rigid line of her shoulders relax, just a fraction. He had not brought anyone to this place since his mother died. It was his, a private sanctuary built from a memory, a space where the crushing weight of his name and his obligations could not reach him. Leo knew of its existence, of course, but even he understood it was off limits. Bringing Elena here was an impulse, a breach of a dozen unspoken rules he had lived by for more than a decade. He was breaking his own code for a girl he barely knew. The thought was as unsettling as it was undeniable. Elena walked slowly toward the center of the garden, her hand outstretched as if to confirm that the plants were real. She touched the soft, velvety petal of a white rose. It was cool and delicate. Tears pricked at the backs of her eyes, hot and sudden. It was just a flower, but it was the first beautiful, living thing she had touched in what felt like a lifetime. She started, her voice a rough whisper. She cleared her throat. It's real. Julian moved to stand near the stone wall, keeping a respectful distance. It is. She turned to look at him, her expression a mixture of awe and confusion. Why, she asked softly. Why is this here? He looked away from her, his gaze settling on the gnarled branches of the olive tree. He had not spoken of this to anyone. Not to his father, not to Leo, not to the faceless men who followed his orders without question. But looking at her, at the raw, unguarded emotion on her face, the words came unbidden. "My mother loved gardens," he said. The statement hung in the air, simple and profound. "She had one at our old house. Before," he let the sentence trail off, "before the assassinations, before his world was rebuilt on a foundation of vengeance and paranoia, before he had learned to sever every emotional tie." He paused, the silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the gentle sound of the fountain. "She passed away when I was young." The confession was flat, devoid of self-pity. It was a simple, brutal fact, a piece of his history he had locked away for years. He was handing her a key to a door he had thought was permanently sealed. Elena stared at him. In that moment, the fearsome Mafia boss, the man who held her life in his hands, vanished. She saw only a boy who had lost his mother. A profound, aching empathy washed over her, a feeling so strong it was almost dizzying. It was a pain she understood, a hollowness that no amount of time or money or power could ever fill. His confession was a gift, an offering of vulnerability that she felt compelled to meet with her own. Her hand moved instinctively to her neck, her fingers closing around the small, worn shape of the medallion hidden beneath her shirt. It was a familiar, comforting gesture, one she had made thousands of times. "My mother is gone too," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The words felt heavy, real, spoken aloud in this strange, secret place. She drew the thin silver chain out from under the collar of her shirt. The St. Christopher's medallion lay in her palm, its surface worn smooth by years of anxious touch. "This was hers," she explained. "She gave it to me right before she died. She said it would keep me safe." A sad, faint smile touched her lips. "I'm not sure it's working very well." Julian's gaze dropped to the small piece of silver resting in her palm. He saw the faded image of the saint, the worn edges, the way her fingers curled around it as if it were a lifeline. It was the same medallion he had noticed in the alley, the first human detail he had registered about her in that moment of chaos. He had claimed her to demonstrate his power, to draw a line in the sand for her father and for his own men. But now, looking at that small, pathetic piece of faith, his reasons felt far more complicated. He was protecting the girl who clutched her dead mother's charm and believed, against all evidence, in saints. The air between them shifted. The space, which had felt charged with tension and fear, was now filled with a different kind of energy. It was quiet, somber, but intensely intimate. They were no longer captor and captive, protector and victim. They were two solitary people standing in a hidden garden who had just shown each other their deepest wounds. The city noise was a distant hum, a world away. Here there was only the scent of damp earth, the sound of water, and the shared weight of their grief. He felt an almost overpowering urge to close the distance between them, to reach out and touch her hand, to offer a comfort he himself had never known how to accept. But he remained frozen, his hands clenched into fists in his pockets. Control. Control was survival. He had built his entire empire on that single principle. Emotion was a weakness his enemies would exploit without hesitation. His father and brother were dead because they had forgotten that lesson. Elena, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in years, let the medallion fall back against her skin, a cool weight against her heart. She felt his eyes on her, but for the first time, his gaze did not feel threatening. It felt watchful, protective. She took a deep breath, the clean, earthy air filling her lungs, and walked toward a bed of lush, green ferns near the edge of the garden. She knelt down, her fingers gently tracing the intricate, lace-like pattern of a single frond. She focused on the delicate lines, the perfect symmetry of nature. It was so simple, so peaceful. For a single, fleeting moment, she was not a runaway. She was not a prisoner. She was just a girl, in a garden, touching a leaf. Julian watched her. He watched the way the faint sunlight caught in her dark hair. He watched the slender line of her back as she knelt, the careful, gentle way her fingers moved over the plant. A feeling rose up in him, fierce and primal. It was a raw, territorial instinct to protect her and to keep her safe within these walls, to shield her from the world that had already caused her so much pain. The feeling was so powerful it was a physical ache in his chest, and warring against it was every cold, hard lesson he had ever learned. Every betrayal he had witnessed, every rule he had enforced with ruthless discipline. Attachments were anchors that dragged you to the bottom. Compassion was a weapon that your enemies would turn against you and everyone you cared about. He had spent his entire adult life building ideologies around his heart, reinforcing them with steel and stone until he was certain nothing could ever get through. He watched her trace the pattern on the leaf, completely unaware of the violent conflict raging inside him. Every instinct, sharpened by years of survival, screamed at him to shield her from all harm, and every scar left by the ghosts of his past warned him that this girl, this fragile, broken girl, would be the one thing that could finally bring his entire world crashing down. The quiet of the rooftop garden felt like a memory from another life. For days, the penthouse had been Elena's entire world, a silent fortress of glass and cool, polished stone. The city below was a sprawling, soundless map. She had forgotten what it felt like to walk on a public street, to feel the sun without a pane of armored glass between her and the sky. Julian had decided her lingering bruises and the cut on her cheek needed proper medical attention. He had spoken of a private clinic, a place as secure as the penthouse itself, but the word outside had landed in her stomach like a stone. Leo Sterling stood by the vast window, his posture rigid, his disapproval a silent, radiating force in the room. He had not argued with Julian in front of her, but he didn't need to. His every clipped movement, the hard set of his jaw, screamed that this was a mistake, a reckless, emotional error. Julian seemed oblivious to it, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore it. He stood before Elena, his gray eyes searching her face. He had traded his usual dark suit jacket for a softer, charcoal gray cashmere sweater. The change made him seem more approachable, closer to the man who had shown her the fragile blossoms in the garden. "We will be in and out," he said, his voice low and steady. "2 cars. No one will get near you. I give you my word." Elena's fingers went to the St. Christopher's medallion at her throat. It was a nervous habit she couldn't break. She believed him. The terrifying part was that she believed him absolutely. She believed in the 2 cars, the security, the invisible wall of power he could erect around her. But she also knew that walls invited siege. Her father's face flickered in her mind, his eyes wide with drunken fury. He was still out there, and men like him, cornered and desperate, did not simply give up. "It's just, I haven't been outside," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. It wasn't just about being outside. It was about being a target. The girl Julian Thorne had claimed in an alley. She was no longer just Elena Vance, running from her father. She was now a symbol, a vulnerability attached to a very powerful man. "I know," Julian said, and for a moment his gaze softened with that same conflicted concern she had seen in the garden. "That is why this is necessary. We need to ensure you are healing properly, and you cannot stay in this apartment forever. This is the first step." His logic was sound, irrefutable, but her fear wasn't logical. It was a living thing, a creature with claws that had been nesting in her chest for years. She looked past him at Leo, who met her gaze for a fraction of a second. His eyes were cold, professional. They held no sympathy, only assessment. He saw her for what she was, a problem, a liability. She drew in a breath, the clean, sterile air of the penthouse filling her lungs one last time. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "Okay." The journey down in the private elevator was silent. The descent felt like a slow fall from grace, from the sterile safety of the sky back down to the messy, unpredictable earth. Julian stood beside her, not touching, but his presence was a solid, grounding weight. Leo was on her other side, his eyes fixed on the floor indicator, his mind clearly running through protocols and threat assessments. In the subterranean garage, 2 identical black sedans waited, engines humming. They were sleek, imposing, their tinted windows reflecting the stark concrete walls like dark mirrors. Several men in sharp suits stood by, their faces impassive. They moved with a quiet, synchronized efficiency that was unnerving. One opened the rear door of the first car for Julian, who then looked to Elena, waiting for her to get in. She slid onto the cool leather seat. The interior smelled of leather and Julian's faint, clean cologne. He got in beside her, and Leo took the front passenger seat. The doors closed with a heavy, satisfying thud, sealing them inside. The sound was meant to be reassuring, the sound of a vault locking. To Elena, it sounded like a cage being shut. The car moved smoothly up the ramp and into the afternoon light. The sudden brightness made Elena flinch. The city was a shock to her senses. It was loud, chaotic, and vibrantly alive. The muted hum of the penthouse was replaced by the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of traffic, the cacophony of 1,000 lives intersecting. People hurried along the sidewalks, heads down, lost in their own worlds, completely unaware of the invisible war being waged in the black sedan moving among them. Elena kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded tightly in her lap. She could feel Julian watching her. She didn't dare look at him, afraid of what she might see in his eyes, or what he might see in hers. Was this what his life was always like? This constant, low-humming tension? This awareness that every intersection, every slowing of traffic, was a potential point of ambush? He had told her about his mother, about his past, but he had not told her about this. He had not described the feeling of being hunted. "Look," he said softly. She lifted her head. He was nodding toward the window. They were passing a small park. Children were chasing pigeons on a patch of green grass, their laughter faintly audible even through the thick glass. An old couple sat on a bench sharing a newspaper. For a few seconds, it was just a normal city scene, a glimpse of a life she once knew, or at least a life she once dreamed of having. A life without fear. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "It feels like a different planet," she murmured. "It is," Julian replied, his voice flat. "And it isn't." Before she could ask what he meant, Leo's voice cut through the air, sharp and low. "We're 5 minutes out. Second car is holding 2 blocks back." Street looks clear. The spell was broken. The normal world vanished. They were back in his world. The world of tactical positions and clear streets. Lena's stomach tightened again. She watched as buildings she didn't recognize slid past her window. The architecture became more sterile, the storefronts more exclusive. They were entering a part of the city where wealth was a fortress, where privacy was the ultimate luxury. The clinic was a discreet limestone building set back from the street, fronted by a manicured row of hedges. It looked more like a private art gallery than a medical facility. There was no sign, only a polished brass number on the door. Their car pulled up to the curb, and the second sedan glided to a stop behind them, effectively blocking the street. Everything happened with that same unnerving precision. A man from the second car was already on the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the rooftops. Another stood by their car door. Leo opened his own door but didn't get out, his body angled to watch both the street and the building entrance. "Stay close to me," Julian said to Elena. It was not a request. The door beside her opened. The city air rushed in, carrying the scent of exhaust and damp pavement. Elena took a breath, preparing to step out. Julian's hand was lightly on her back, a firm guiding pressure. She put one foot on the sidewalk, her eyes on the polished brass of the clinic's front door. It was only 10 feet away. 10 feet of open space. It was the screech of tires that came first, a high, tearing sound that ripped through the curated quiet of the street. Elena's head whipped to the left. A dark green sedan, something old and battered, had swerved violently from the opposite lane. It jumped the curb, its engine roaring like a wounded animal. It wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating, its grille aimed directly at her. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing. She saw a face in the passenger window, a man's face, pale and grim. Her mind couldn't process it. Her body was frozen, her foot still half in the car, half on the pavement. The 10 feet to the clinic door suddenly seemed like an impossible mile. Then the world exploded into motion. "Down!" The word was a guttural roar, and it came from Leo. He wasn't in the car anymore. He was beside her, a blur of motion. He didn't gently push her. He hit her, a solid, brutal shove that sent her sprawling sideways onto the cold, gritty sidewalk. The impact knocked the wind out of her. Her head hit the pavement, not hard, but enough to make stars burst behind her eyes. In the same instant, a sound like a string of firecrackers erupted, sharp and deafeningly loud. It was followed by the musical, terrifying shatter of glass. The windows of their own black sedan imploded. Shards rained down around her. Elena's ears were ringing. She was on her hands and knees, disoriented, trying to draw a breath that wouldn't come. Her cheek was pressed against the dirty concrete, the smell of dust and old rain filling her nostrils. Then, another body covered hers. It was Julian. He had thrown himself over her, creating a human shield. His weight was immense, solid, pressing her into the ground. She could feel the hard lines of his body, the tension in every muscle. One of his arms was hooked around her waist, holding her tight against him, while the other was braced on the pavement beside her head. His cashmere sweater was rough against her cheek. She could hear his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, powerful rhythm that seemed to echo the chaos around them. More sounds erupted, deeper pops, return fire. The green car's engine screamed and then died with a final metallic crunch as it collided with the front of their empty sedan. Shouts echoed down the street. The ringing in Elena's ears was a high-pitched whine. Through it all, Julian didn't move. He remained over her, a solid wall of bone and muscle. His breath was hot against her ear. He wasn't saying anything. He was just breathing, deep and controlled, a stark contrast to the wild pounding of his heart. Elena's own heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. Fear was a cold liquid pouring through her veins. This was real. The abstract threat, the whispers overheard in the penthouse, the cold look in Leo's eyes. It had all become this: the smell of gunpowder, the sting of grit on her skin, the weight of a man shielding her from bullets. Slowly the sounds began to subside. The shouting became more organized. The pop of gunfire ceased. There was only the ticking of a cooling engine and the distant, approaching wail of sirens. Julian still didn't move. He stayed over her, his body a tense shield, listening. Elena could feel the moment the tension in his shoulders shifted. It was a subtle change, a release of one kind of readiness and the arrival of another, colder one. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a low rasp right next to her ear. It was raw, strained. She tried to answer, but her throat was tight. She managed a small shake of her head, a movement he must have felt. He pushed himself up slowly, moving off of her. The sudden loss of his weight made her feel terrifyingly exposed. Cold air rushed over the places where he had been. He knelt beside it, and his hand still on her back. His face was pale, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped near his ear. His gray eyes, usually so controlled, were blazing with a fire she had never seen before. He scanned her from head to toe, searching for injury, his gaze frantic and intense. "Elena," he said again, his voice sharper this time. "Are you hurt?" "No," she managed to choke out. Her voice was a ragged whisper. "I don't think so." He reached out and brushed a piece of shattered glass from her hair. His touch was surprisingly gentle, but his fingers were trembling slightly. Or maybe she was the one who was trembling. She couldn't tell. Leo appeared at Julian's side. His face was a grim mask. He had a gun in his hand, held low and steady. He didn't look at Elena. He only looked at Julian. "They're gone," Leo said, his voice clipped. "Two of them. The driver is down. The passenger got away in a chase car that was waiting." Julian's gaze shifted from Elena to Leo. And in that moment, Elena saw the transformation. The frantic concern for her safety drained away from his face. It was like a mask dropping, but instead of revealing a softer face beneath, it revealed one made of ice and steel. The warmth, the conflict, the humanity she had seen in the garden, it all vanished. It was replaced by something utterly chilling, a pure own in absolute fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He pulled a phone from his pocket. His movements were economical, precise, deadly. He pressed a single button. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. It was so quiet that Elena, kneeling right beside him, could barely hear it. But it was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard in her life. It held no heat, no rage, only the calm, surgical certainty of destruction. "Find them," he said into the phone. It was just 2 words. But in those 2 words, Elena heard the fall of empires. She heard the silent, efficient work of men who lived in shadows. She heard the finality of a death sentence delivered without trial. It wasn't a command born of anger. It was an order to correct an error, to eliminate a variable. The variable was the man who had tried to harm her. The line on the other end must have acknowledged the order because Julian closed the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He never took his eyes off the middle distance, staring at the wreckage of the green car as if he could see right through it, to the men who had sent it. He was no longer the man who had brought her a glass of water in the middle of the night. He was not the man who found solace in a secret garden. This was Julian Thorne, the man his enemies feared, the man his own men obeyed without question. This was the lethal reality of the power she had clung to in that dark alley. She had asked a stranger to hold her, and in doing so she had bound herself to this terrifying, calm lethality. He finally looked back down at her. His eyes were still cold, but the burning rage had been banked, hidden behind a wall of control. He held out a hand to help her up. "Come," he said, his voice back to its usual low timbre, but with an edge of tempered steel she had never heard before. "We are leaving." Elena stared at his outstretched hand. Her own was shaking. She could see a smear of dirt on her palm and a small bleeding scrape. The sight of her own blood seemed distant, unreal. All she could focus on was his face, the face of her protector, the face of a killer. Slowly, she placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was strong, unyielding as he pulled her to her feet. The world swayed around her for a moment. Her ears were still ringing. The air still smelled of smoke and fear. As Julian pulled her to her feet, Elena stared at him, her heart pounding not just from the attack, but from the chillingly calm lethality she now saw in his eyes. The elevator ascended in absolute silence. The only sound was a low, electronic hum, a noise that felt too sterile for the terror still clinging to the air between them. Elena's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She could still hear the impossible sound of glass shattering, the sharp crack of gunfire that had ripped through the ordinary city street. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She stared at the polished steel of the elevator doors, refusing to look at the man standing beside her. She could feel his presence, a column of heat and stillness. Julian had not said a word since pulling her to her feet on the sidewalk. His face, when she had dared to look, was a mask of cold, controlled fury that had nothing to do with protection and everything to do with destruction. The man who had gently dabbed a cut on her cheek seemed like a ghost, a dream she had invented. This man was a killer. The calm lethality she saw in his eyes was not just for his enemies. It was a part of him, a constant, simmering threat. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the vast, empty space of the penthouse. The silence here was different. It was heavier, filled with unspoken things. Julian walked ahead of her, his expensive shoes making no sound on the polished concrete floor. He went to the bar, his back to her, and poured 2 glasses of water with steady hands. The simple domestic act felt bizarre, a scene from a different life. He turned and held one out to her. Elena flinched. She didn't move to take it. Her fear, which had been a cold, paralyzing dread, was beginning to burn. It was morphing into a hot, wild anger. She had been a pawn, a piece of bait dangled in front of a rival to see if he would bite. Her life had been a calculated risk in a game she didn't understand. "I won't drink it," she said. Her voice was a raw whisper, but it cut through the quiet of the room. Julian's hand remained extended, his expression unreadable. "Why?" he asked, his own voice low and even. The question was so calm, so rational, that it felt like a match thrown on gasoline. "Why?" she repeated, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. "Why? Because I don't know what's in it. Because I don't know what you are. Because people just tried to kill me." Her voice grew louder with each word, shaking with the force of her terror and rage. "No," she corrected herself, taking a step back. "They didn't try to kill me. They tried to kill her, the girl with Julian Thorne, the liability, the target." Julian slowly lowered the glass and placed it on the marble countertop. He watched her, his gray eyes narrowed. The scar through his eyebrow seemed darker, a permanent mark of violence. "My intention was to keep you safe, Elena." The words were clipped, precise. He sounded like a man giving a report, not a person offering comfort. Your intention? She shot back, her arms wrapping around herself. What about your methods? Did you tell your men to stand down just enough? To let them get close enough to prove a point? Her mind was racing, connecting invisible dots, painting a picture of cold, ruthless strategy. She remembered the alley, how he had claimed her. She's with me. It wasn't a promise of safety. It was a declaration of ownership. And what he owned, he could use. You think I wanted that to happen? He asked. There was a dangerous edge to his voice now, a flicker of the fury she had seen on the street. I think you're used to getting what you want, she accused, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. I think you saw a way to draw out an enemy, and I was the perfect, pathetic excuse. A broken little bird you could put in a cage and wait for the wolves to circle. The words tumbled out, bitter and sharp. She was finally giving a voice to the fear that had haunted her since she arrived. This place was not a sanctuary. It was the center of a war, and she was the battlefield. Julian took a step toward her. She took a step back, her body tensing. That's not what this is, he said, his voice dropping again, becoming almost persuasive. I brought you here to protect you. Protect me, she cried, gesturing wildly at the opulent room, the floor-to-ceiling windows showing a city that felt a million miles away. You brought me into the heart of the danger. You put a target on my back that wasn't there before. My father, he was just a man, a pathetic, cruel man. But your enemies, they have guns and they have no faces. You haven't protected me. You've just upgraded my monster. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. She scrubbed it away angrily. She would not cry in front of him. She would not be weak. He took another step, closing the distance between them. I will handle Gallo, he stated, as if it were a simple fact. You will be safe here. The sheer arrogance of his certainty made her snap. Don't you get it? I will never be safe with you. As long as I am with you, I am a thing, a weakness, a pressure point. Is that what I am to you, Julian? A possession you have to guard? Another one of your expensive, beautiful things that no one else is allowed to touch? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and glittering and ugly. She saw something shift in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something that looked almost like pain. He had built his entire world on control, on the cold logic of assets and threats. People were pieces on a board. But her words suggested he was no different from his enemies, from men like Gallo who saw people as currency. For a long, silent moment, he just stared at her. The fury was gone from his face, replaced by a profound, weary frustration. He looked like a man trapped by his own power. He had the means to destroy armies, but he had no words to calm the terrified woman standing 3 feet in front of him. He started, then stopped. He seemed to have no answer. He, who always had an answer. That was all she needed to see. Her anger dissolved, leaving behind only a hollow, aching fear. She turned away from him, unable to look at him anymore. I want to be alone, she whispered, and walked on trembling legs toward the bedroom that felt more like a cell than ever. She didn't look back to see if he watched her go. She just closed the door behind her, the soft click of the lock sounding as final as a prison gate. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood, her body shaking uncontrollably. The fight had drained everything from her. She had screamed at the most dangerous man she had ever met, and the most terrifying part was not his anger, but the flicker of desolate conflict in his eyes. It meant she was right. She was a problem he didn't know how to solve, and in his world, unsolved problems were eliminated. Julian stood motionless in the center of the living room long after she had gone. The glass of water sat on the counter, untouched. He could still feel the phantom impact of bullets against the armored car, the primal instinct that had made him cover her body with his own. He had felt no fear for himself, only a white-hot, blinding rage that someone had dared to harm her. He had built an empire on a foundation of emotional detachment. His father and brother were dead because of a moment of carelessness, a personal connection a rival had exploited. Julian had learned the lesson in blood and grief. He had walled off his heart so completely that he sometimes forgot it was there, until Elena. He ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion hitting him like a physical blow. Her words echoed in the silent room. A possession, another one of your expensive things. It was the worst thing she could have said because it was the one accusation he feared was true. He had claimed her, marked her as his, and in doing so he had endangered her more than her own father ever could. He walked to the window, staring out at the indifferent city lights. He had failed to protect her, and he hated himself for it. Hours later, the penthouse was still dark. Julian hadn't moved from the window. The city below had quieted, the endless streams of headlights thinning to a trickle. The only light in the room came from the faint glow of the skyline, casting long, distorted shadows. The quiet was broken by the sound of the private elevator arriving. Julian didn't turn. He knew who it was. The footsteps were precise, confident. Leo Sterling stopped a respectful 10 feet behind him. For a full minute, neither of them spoke. Leo was a creature of the same shadows that had raised Julian. He understood the necessity of silence. "The preliminary report is on your desk," Leo finally said. His voice was clipped, devoid of emotion. "The car was stolen 2 days ago. The hit was professional. They knew the route to the clinic. They knew she would be in the car." Julian remained silent, his gaze fixed on the sprawling darkness outside. "They were Gallo's men," Julian stated. It wasn't a question. "We have one of them," Leo confirmed. "He's not talkative, but yes, it was Gallo." Another heavy silence fell. Leo took a step closer. He was the only person alive who would dare. "This is what I warned you about, Julian," he said, his voice low but intense. "From the moment you brought her here. She is a beacon. She is a vulnerability we cannot afford." Julian's jaw tightened. He could feel Leo's disapproval, his cold logic pressing in on him. "She is the first crack in the foundation. Gallo sees it. Everyone will see it. He didn't send his best men. This wasn't a kill mission. This was a test. He was testing your response. He wanted to see how you would react when she was threatened." Leo's words were like stones, hard and factual. And he got his answer. "You shielded her yourself. You put your own body on the line for a stray you found in an alley." Julian turned from the window, his face a mask of cold fury. "Watch your tone, Leo." "My tone," Leo shot back, his professional calm finally cracking. "I am trying to keep you alive. I am trying to protect the empire your father died for, an empire your brother died for. They died because our enemies found a weakness, a personal tie, a woman. Are you so determined to follow them?" The mention of his family was a deliberate, brutal strike. Leo knew it was Julian's deepest wound. He was using it to make his point, because he believed the stakes were that high. "She is not the same," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She's exactly the same." Leo's voice rose, echoing in the cavernous room. "She is a person you care about. And in our world, that is a weapon that can be used against you. It doesn't matter if she's a good person. It doesn't matter if she's innocent. Her innocence is what makes her the perfect liability." Leo stepped forward again, his eyes pleading. "Julian, listen to me. This is not a judgment. This is a fact. As long as she is here, as long as she is under your protection, you are compromised. Every decision you make will be filtered through what might happen to her. You will hesitate. You will be predictable. Gallo knows this. He will not stop. The next time, he will not miss." Julian turned his back on him again, returning his gaze to the window. He could feel the truth in Leo's words. It was the same old hard logic he had lived by his entire life. It was the code of his family. Attachments or weaknesses, emotions or liabilities, protect the family, the organization, above all else. "End this now," Leo urged, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Send her away, give her money, a new identity, a new life somewhere far from here. Protect her by letting her go, before she gets you killed, before she gets us all killed." The plea hung in the air. It was the logical choice, the smart choice. It was the choice his father would have made. It was the choice Julian himself would have made without a second thought, only weeks ago. But the thought of sending Elena away, of putting her back out into a world that had only ever hurt her, felt like an amputation. It felt like a betrayal, not of his code, but of something more fundamental. He remembered the desperate grip of her fingers on his jacket in the alley. He remembered the fragile trust in her eyes in the rooftop garden. He remembered the terror on her face today and the overwhelming, instinctual need to stand between her and the threat. Leo waited for an answer, for an order, for a sign that the Julian he knew, the cold, disciplined leader, was still in control. But Julian said nothing. His silence was the only answer he could give. It was a gaping void where a command should have been. After another long, tense moment, Leo seemed to understand. He had lost the argument. He had lost it to a ghost, to a feeling he couldn't see or quantify. With a quiet, frustrated sigh, he turned. "You're making a mistake," he said softly to Julian's back. "A fatal one." Then his footsteps retreated, and Julian heard the soft chime of the elevator doors opening and closing, leaving him in absolute solitude once more. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer just empty, it was accusatory. Julian stood alone before the vast expanse of glass, the city lights glittering like a million tiny, watchful eyes. He saw his own reflection staring back at him. The man in the glass was the image of power, tall, imposing, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. His face was hard, his eyes were cold. It was the face of Julian Thorne, the head of the family, the man who held the city in his unforgiving grip. It was the face he had constructed piece by piece over the years, a fortress built on the ruins of his grief. But tonight he could feel the man behind the reflection. A man who was shaken, a man who was furious at his own powerlessness, a man haunted by a woman's terrified accusation that he was just another monster. He thought of Leo's warning, the echoes of his father's rigid doctrines. Protect the empire, trust no one. Love is a death sentence. Then he thought of Elena, alone in the other room, likely staring at her own reflection and seeing only a target. For the first time since the night he learned his father and brother were gone, the fortress had been breached. The two sides of him, the ruthless boss and the man who wanted to protect one fragile life, were at war. Julian stands alone before the window, staring at his own reflection, and for the first time since his father's death, he feels completely and utterly torn. Julian stood before the vast expanse of glass, a silhouette against the city he commanded. His reflection stared back, a mask of control he had worn for more than a decade. But tonight the mask felt thin, brittle. The argument with Elena, followed by Leo's cold, logical condemnation, had chipped away at the foundation of his world. He had built an empire on the principle of no weaknesses, no attachments, no one to hold hostage, no one to mourn. And then a girl with haunted eyes had stumbled out of an alley and begged him to hold her. He had made a choice in that moment, an impulsive, human choice. Now the consequences echoed in the silence of his fortress. For the first time since he had buried his father and brother, Julian Thorne felt the cold grip of fear, not for himself, but for her. He was torn not between love and duty, but between the man he had become to survive and the man she made him wish he could be. Miles away in a dimly lit office that smelled of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey, Richard Vance was being sold a different version of the story. He sat opposite Marcus Gallo, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. Gallo's suit was worth more than Richard's car, and he wore his power with an easy reptilian grace. He slid a glass of amber liquid across the polished desk. Richard's hand trembled as he took it. He was a cornered animal, reeking of desperation. "He has her, Richard," Gallo said, his voice a smooth, reasonable purr. "Julian Thorne, he took your daughter. You saw it yourself." Richard swallowed the whiskey in one gulp, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. He said she was with him. She ran to him. The words tasted like ash. He was trying to convince himself as much as Gallo. Gallo leaned forward, his expression a perfect mask of sympathy. "Of course she did. She was terrified. A man like Thorne, he radiates power. People are drawn to it, like moths to a flame. They don't see the fire until it's too late." He paused, letting the image sink in. "I've known the Thorne family for a long time. They don't protect people, Richard. They collect them. They see something they want, and they take it." Richard's mind, clouded by alcohol and self-pity, latched onto the narrative. It was easier than admitting he had driven his daughter into the arms of a monster. Julian wasn't a savior, he was a kidnapper. Elena wasn't safe, she was a prisoner. What does he want with her? Richard asked, his voice a pathetic whine. Leverage, Gallo said simply. He knows you owe me. He knows that by holding your daughter, he holds a knife to my throat. He's using her, Richard, using your little girl as a pawn in a game she can't possibly understand. The lie was brilliant in its simplicity. It twisted Julian's protective act into one of cold, calculating aggression. It made Richard a victim, not a failed father. That bastard, Richard slurred, a surge of righteous anger momentarily clearing the alcoholic fog. My Elena. I want to help you get her back, Gallo said, his tone soft, conspiratorial. But his fortress is, well, it's a fortress. My men have been watching for weeks. The security is airtight. There's no way in. Not through the front, not through the garage. He sighed, a theatrical gesture of defeat. Unless someone knew a way, a flaw in the design, a back door that security doesn't watch as closely. Richard's bloodshot eyes flickered. A memory surfaced, hazy but distinct. Years ago, before his life had completely unraveled, he'd done some contract work, a plumbing subcontract for a new skyscraper downtown, the Thorn Tower. He remembered the blueprints, the endless corridors, the service shafts. He remembered complaining about a specific design choice, a consolidated utility shaft with a single service entrance on the roof of the adjoining parking structure. It was designed for maintenance access to the building's core systems. It was meant to be secure, but its access point was technically outside the tower's primary security perimeter. He had once called it a disaster waiting to happen. He looked at Gallo, the gears of betrayal grinding in his head. This was his way out. Forgive his debts, get his daughter back, be the hero. The thought was intoxicating. There might be a way, Richard said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A service entrance, on the 5th floor roof of the parking garage next door. It leads to the main utility conduit. Gallo's smile finally reached his eyes. It was cold and sharp as splintered ice. He had him. Tell me everything, he said, pushing the bottle of whiskey toward Richard, and we'll bring your daughter home. Richard began to talk, trading his daughter's safety for a few more days of hollow, worthless life. Back in the penthouse, the silence was a physical weight. Lena sat curled on one end of a long, white sofa, her knees drawn to her chest. She had been staring at the same page of a book for 20 minutes, not reading a single word. Across the room, Julian stood by the wet bar, swirling amber liquid in a glass, the exact shade of the one her father was drinking miles away. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words to her since their argument after the attack. The air was thick with things unsaid. His frustration, her fear, the terrifying unspoken truth that her presence had brought violence to his door. Leo was there too, of course. He stood near the entrance to the main living area, a statue in a perfectly tailored suit. His gaze was fixed on the city lights, but Elena could feel the weight of his attention on her. He was a hawk, and she was the mouse brought into the nest. He had been right. She was a liability. The thought was a sharp, painful sting. She wanted to hate him for it, but she couldn't. He was only trying to protect his world, his family. And she was the intruder. Julian finally moved, his footsteps unnervingly silent on the polished concrete floor. He stopped in front of her, placing a glass of water on the table beside the sofa. You should drink something, he said. His voice was low, strained. She didn't look at him, she just stared at the book in her lap. I'm not thirsty. Elena. He said her name, and the sound was a plea. It held all the frustration and regret he couldn't seem to voice. What happened today should not have happened. But it did, she whispered, her voice tight. And it will happen again, won't it? As long as I'm here. She finally looked up at him, her hazel eyes wide with a mixture of fear and accusation. Leo was right about me. The mention of his right-hand man seemed to stiffen Julian's spine. He glanced over at Leo, who remained perfectly still, his face unreadable. Leo is paid to assess risk, Julian said, his voice turning colder, more formal. It's not personal. It feels personal, Elena shot back, a spark of defiance flaring in her chest. It feels like I'm a problem you have to manage. A chess piece on your board. Before Julian could answer, a subtle flicker in the lights made them all pause. The hum of the building's climate control system seemed to dip for a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, a technological hiccup. But in Julian Thorne's world, there were no hiccups. Leo's head snapped toward the main entryway. His hand went instantly to the inside of his jacket. "Julian," he said, his voice low and urgent. Julian's entire posture shifted. The conflicted man was gone, replaced by the predator. His eyes scanned the room, assessing angles, exits. "Elena, get behind the sofa, now." His tone left no room for argument. She scrambled off the couch, her heart suddenly pounding against her ribs. She crouched behind it, the thick upholstery offering a pathetic sense of cover. Then, a sound. A muffled thud from the direction of the service corridor, far from the main elevators. It was the sound of a reinforced door being breached. It was followed by the sharp, metallic click of the emergency locks engaging throughout the penthouse. They were being sealed in. A soft chime sounded from a security panel on the wall, and a calm, automated voice spoke into the room. "Security protocol initiated. Zone 7 breached." Zone 7. Julian's face was grim. That was the core utility shaft, an entrance that was supposed to be impossible to access. He drew his own weapon, the movement of fluid, practiced motion. He and Leo moved together without a word, positioning themselves on either side of the archway that led from the main living space to the rest of the penthouse. They were a seamless unit, forged in years of violence. Elena pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle a cry. This was it. The beautiful, dangerous trap had just been sprung. Her father's face flashed in her mind, his desperate, pleading eyes. And then Gallows. Smooth, confident. She had a sickening feeling she knew exactly how this had happened. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. 4. Then the sound of running footsteps on the marble floor of the hallway. Not the clumsy, panicked running of civilians, but the disciplined, heavy tread of trained men. They were already inside, deep inside. 2 figures in black tactical gear appeared in the archway. They moved low and fast, rifles raised. They were not common street thugs. They were professionals. Elite. The room erupted in a cacophony of violence. Julian and Leo opened fire at the same instant. The noise was deafening, the flash of the muzzles blinding in the low light. Glass from a nearby sculpture shattered, spraying across the floor. One of the intruders fell, a dark shape crumpling to the ground. The other ducked back into the hallway. "They used the service conduit," Leo yelled over the ringing in their ears. "They bypassed everything." More men poured into the hallway. It was a full-scale assault. Gunfire tore through the room, chewing up the plaster walls and shredding the expensive furniture. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, pressing herself against the floor. The air filled with the smell of cordite. This was a war zone. Her sanctuary had become a battlefield. Through a gap in the sofa, she saw Julian moving with a terrifying grace. He used a thick concrete pillar for cover, firing with precise, controlled bursts. He was not a man anymore. He was a weapon. Cold, efficient, and lethal. He was protecting his home. He was protecting her. Leo was a mirror image, guarding the other side of the room. He was shouting into a small radio, clipped to his collar, trying to coordinate a response with the building's security team. But the line was likely dead. They were cut off, trapped. Another attacker burst into the room, his rifle swinging towards the sofa, towards her. He had seen her, his eyes locked on hers for a split second. He was not aiming for Julian. He was aiming for the leverage, for the weakness. Elena's entire world slowed down. The sounds of the fight faded to a dull roar. All she could see was the dark bore of the rifle. She was frozen, a deer caught in the headlights. She had run from her father, from a life of casual brutality, only to find herself at the epicenter of a war. There was nowhere left to run. Then a blur of motion. Leo. He had been closer. He had seen the gunman's intention. With a desperate roar, he lunged from his position of cover. He didn't fire his weapon. He didn't have time. His only thought was to shield her. He threw himself in front of Elena, his body a human shield. The rifle cracked, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through all the others. Leo's body jerked violently, as if struck by an invisible hammer. A strangled gasp escaped his lips. He stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him towards her. His sharp, intelligent eyes were wide with shock and pain. He looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Not accusation, not regret, just surprise. He collapsed at her feet. A dark, wet stain was already spreading across the crisp white shirt beneath his jacket, high on his chest. Julian screamed Leo's name, a raw, guttural sound of pure rage and agony. He emptied his clip at the man who had shot his friend, his brother in all but blood. The attacker fell back, his body hitting the wall with a sickening thud. But Elena didn't see it. Her world had shrunk to the man lying on the floor in front of her. Leo, the man who had called her a liability, the man who had warned Julian to get rid of her, the man who had just saved her life. The penthouse's internal alarms finally blared to life, a shrieking, incessant wail that pulsed with red emergency lights. The calm, automated voice was gone, replaced by a raw, mechanical scream. The gunfire was getting closer again, more men flooding in, their boots crunching on shattered glass. They were being overrun. Elena crawled out from behind the sofa, oblivious to the danger. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the dust and debris. She reached for Leo, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them. "Leo," she choked out, the name a broken whisper. His eyes were half open, but he wasn't seeing anything. His breathing was shallow, ragged. She pressed her hands to the wound on his chest, a desperate, futile attempt to stop the bleeding. The fabric of his shirt was slick and warm beneath her palms. The reality of it, the heat of it, sent a jolt of pure horror through her. The sound of gunfire was right outside the archway now. Julian was shouting orders she couldn't understand, his voice strained with fury and grief. The world was ending. This perfect, sterile cage was being torn apart, and the man who had been its staunchest defender was bleeding out at her feet. It was her fault. All of it, her fault. Elena screamed Leo's name, the sound torn from her throat. A raw, piercing cry of anguish that was swallowed by the blare of the alarms and the roar of the approaching fight. The scream tore from Elena's throat, raw and thin against the shriek of the alarms. Red. Everything was turning red. Leo's crisp white shirt, the pristine marble floor, her own hands, slick and warm, as she pressed down on the wound. It was useless. The blood seeped between her fingers, a tide she could not stop. Gunshots echoed from the main living area, sharp cracks of sound that made her flinch. They were inside. They were everywhere. The sanctuary was a tomb, and the walls were closing in. Leo's eyes were glassy, his breathing a shallow, ragged thing. He had looked at her with such suspicion, such disdain. He had seen her as a weakness, a fatal flaw in Julian's world. And he was right. He had thrown himself in front of her, and now he was dying at her feet because of it. Julian was a blur of motion. He knelt beside her, his hand covering hers, pressing down with brutal force. His touch was not gentle now. It was desperate. "Stay with him," he ordered, his voice a low growl that cut through the noise. He ripped a strip from the bottom of a nearby curtain, folding it into a thick pad and shoving it under her hands. "Press here, harder." His eyes were not on Leo. They were scanning the room, calculating, his face a mask of terrible, cold fury. The concern she had seen in him before was gone, burned away and replaced by something ancient and lethal. He was no longer her protector. He was a hunter in his own territory, and his prey was inside. He rose in one fluid movement and crossed to a section of wall that looked like solid granite. His fingers found an invisible seam, and with a soft hiss of displaced air, a heavy steel door slid open, revealing a small, dark space. A panic room. The air that drifted out was cool, sterile, smelling of filtered systems and concrete. It was the scent of a bunker, a cage within a cage. Julian turned back, his gaze locking with hers. Get him inside. Now. Together they half-dragged, half-carried Leo's dead weight across the floor, leaving a dark trail on the polished stone. They guided him into the small, windowless room, laying him gently on the floor. The alarm sounded muffled and distant once inside. Julian knelt, checking Leo's pulse. His jaw was tight. "He needs a doctor. I can't call one until the building is clear." He looked at Elena, his gray eyes pinning her in place. The coldness in them was absolute. "Keep pressure on the wound. Do not let him move." Do not open this door for anyone but me. He started to back out of the room. No, Elena whispered, the words sticking in her throat. Don't leave me in here. Don't leave us. Julian paused at the threshold, the case of the penthouse behind him. I'm not leaving you, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm finishing this. The steel door slid shut with a final heavy thud, sealing them in an unnerving silence. For a moment, Elena could only hear the frantic beat of her own heart and the faint, labored sound of Leo's breathing. She was locked away again, a treasure to be hidden while the battle raged outside. But this time was different. This time, the cost of her safety was lying on the floor beside her, bleeding out. The helplessness was a poison, and a new feeling began to curdle in her stomach. It was not fear, it was rage. The room was stark, equipped with a bank of monitors showing security feeds from every corner of the penthouse. Elena's eyes were drawn to them. She watched as dark figures in tactical gear moved through the familiar spaces, sweeping rooms with an invasive predatory confidence. They moved through the library, past the rooftop garden doors, into the kitchen, her sanctuary, her haven. And then she saw him. On a camera feed from the main corridor, her father, Richard Vance, cowered behind a large man she recognized from news clippings as Marcus Gallo. Gallo was smiling and speaking into a radio. Her father looked small and pathetic, his eyes darting around nervously. He thought he had won. He had sold her, delivered her, and now he was hiding behind his new master, waiting to collect his prize. The sight broke something inside her, the years of cowering, of flinching from his raised hand, of living in the shadow of his pathetic cruelty. It all coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. He was a coward. He was predictable, and she knew him better than anyone. She crawled over to the communications panel, her hands still stained with Leo's blood. She found the button for the internal comms and pressed it, her fingers trembling slightly. Julian, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. There was a crackle, then the sound of his breathing, sharp and controlled. Distantly, she heard a muffled concussion. Elena, what is it? Are you all right? His voice was strained. I'm fine. Leo is... he's still with me. She took a breath, her eyes fixed on her father's shivering form on the monitor. I know how to get them. Both of them. There was a long pause on the other end. What are you talking about? My father, she said, the words coming faster now. And Gallo, I'm watching them on the monitors. They're up here. They think they've won. They think you are cornered. She explained it quickly, her own trauma becoming a weapon. He's a coward, Julian. He always has been. He will run to what he thinks is the safest exit, and he's greedy. He'll want to see your downfall for himself before he escapes. Gallo will want to secure his prize. They won't take the service elevators they came in on. That's a rat's nest now. They'll go for the private garage in the sublevel. It's the cleanest way out. She could almost feel his mind working on the other end of the line, processing her logic. He knew tactics. He knew strategy. But she knew the psychology of the man who had tormented her for 20 years. They'll expect you to be trapped up here making a final stand, she continued, her voice gaining strength. They won't expect you to be waiting for them down there. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken meaning. She had crossed a line. She was no longer just the victim he was protecting. She was offering herself as part of the strategy. She was using the intimate knowledge of her own abuse to help him win his war. Finally, his voice came back, devoid of any warmth, all sharp edges. Stay in the room, Elena. Lock the door from the inside using the manual bolt. Do not open it for anyone but me. He didn't confirm her plan. He didn't need to. He trusted her. The line went dead. Elena slid the heavy steel bolt into place. The sound echoed in the small room like the closing of a vault. She turned back to Leo. His eyes were closed now, his face pale. She readjusted her hands on the makeshift bandage, pressing down, willing him to hold on. She was no longer just waiting for rescue. She was part of the fight. Time stretched and warped in the silent, sealed room. Every distant noise from the outside, every flicker on the monitors, sent a jolt through her. She watched as Gallo's men began to fall back, their movements less confident now, more frantic. They were being hunted. On one screen, she saw a shadow move with impossible speed down a hallway. There was a flurry of motion, And then two of Gallo's men were simply gone from the frame. It was Julian. He was a ghost in his own home, a phantom of vengeance reclaiming his territory. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She kept her attention on the camera feed showing her father and Gallo. As she had predicted, Gallo spoke into his radio, his expression souring. The assault had failed. He gave a sharp nod to his remaining men, and they began to move toward the private elevator that led directly to the sub-level garage. Her father scurried behind them like a frightened dog. They were taking the bait. Her bait. A bitter taste filled her mouth. The main bank of monitors suddenly switched, all of them now showing different angles of the sub-level parking garage. It was Julian. He was showing her the final act. The space was vast and empty, a concrete cavern filled with rows of dark, expensive cars. It was silent, save for the faint, rhythmic drip of water from an overhead pipe. Then the elevator doors at the far end slid open. Gallo stepped out, flanked by three men. Her father trailed behind, looking relieved to be so close to escape. They moved toward a black sedan, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Gallo's arrogance was still visible in his stride. He believed the only remaining threat was upstairs, trapped. He opened the car door, and in that instant, the world erupted. Headlights from a dozen cars flashed on at once, pinning them in merciless beams of light. The sound of dozens of safeties being clicked off was a single deadly chorus. From the shadows between the concrete pillars, Julian's men emerged, weapons raised. They were surrounded. Gallo froze, his hand on the car door. His face, caught into the blinding light, was a mask of disbelief turning to rage. Her father let out a pathetic cry and dropped to his knees, his hands clasped in front of him. And then Julian stepped out from behind the pillar nearest to them. He was not wearing his suit jacket anymore. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his forearms smudged with grime and something darker. He moved with a calm, deliberate grace that was more terrifying than any overt display of anger. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice echoing slightly in the huge space. It was conversational, almost casual. "You broke the old rules. You came into my home." Gallo straightened up, a sneer twisting his lips. "Thorn, I thought my men had cleaned up this mess. Guess you have to do everything yourself." He was trying to project confidence, but Elena could see the tremor in his hand. Richard Vance began to crawl on the floor toward Julian. "It wasn't me. I swear, Julian, it was him. He made me do it. He promised he'd clear my debts. His voice dissolved into choked sobs. Julian didn't even look at him. His eyes, cold and flat as slate, were locked on Gallo. "My father and my brother," Julian said softly. "That was you, an old grievance you couldn't let go of." "They were weak," Gallo spat, "just like you've become, hiding a little stray in your penthouse, letting emotion cloud your judgment. She made you weak, Thorn." At that moment, a heavy door to a service stairwell creaked open not far from where Julian stood. Elena stepped out. Her face was pale, her clothes rumpled and stained, but her chin was up. She had disobeyed his order. She had to see this. She had to be here for the end of it. Julian's head turned slightly, his eyes finding her in the shadows. For a heartbeat, his cold expression faltered. It wasn't anger she saw, but a flicker of raw, unguarded shock. He hadn't wanted her to witness this. Gallo's eyes followed Julian's gaze and landed on her. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, well, look what we have here, the little bird who started it all." Julian took a half step, subtly placing himself more directly in front of Elena, shielding her. His attention shifted back to Gallo, but the moment had changed everything. He looked at Gallo, the architect of his family's ruin. He looked at Richard Vance, the man who had sold his own flesh and blood. And then his gaze traveled past them both, across the cold, concrete expanse, and met Elena's. The question was there, clear and unspoken in the grim set of his jaw. He was giving her the final say, her abuser and her hunter, cornered and helpless. Did she want vengeance? Did she want to see them pay for every moment of fear, every tear, every bruise? The entire garage seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. Elena looked at the pathetic, weeping figure of her father crumpled on the dirty concrete. For years, he had been a monster in her mind, a giant whose shadow she could never escape. But here, under the harsh fluorescent lights, he was just a small, weak man, a failure, a ghost. Looking at him, she didn't feel hatred. She didn't feel a desire for revenge. She felt nothing, a vast, quiet emptiness where the fear used to be. Vengeance wouldn't heal her. It would only chain her to him forever. She just wanted it to be over. She wanted him gone from her life, from her world, from her memory. Her eyes met Julian's again. He was waiting. She gave a single, firm shake of her head. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but in the charged silence of the garage, it was a definitive command. Not here. Not like this. Just make it end. A flicker of understanding, maybe even relief, passed through Julian's eyes. He gave a short, sharp nod to two of his men. They moved toward Richard Vance, lifting him roughly to his feet. He started begging, his voice high and thin. "No, please. Elena, tell them, please, I'm your father." Elena didn't look at him. She couldn't. The men dragged him toward a black sedan at the edge of the light. He was still screaming her name when they forced him inside, and the door slammed shut, cutting off the sound. The car's engine started, and it drove smoothly out of the garage, disappearing into the city's network of tunnels. Gone. Now it was just Gallo. He watched the car leave, his sneer gone, replaced by a dawning horror. He looked back at Julian. "You're not going to just let me walk away, Thorne." It wasn't a question. "No," Julian said, his voice flat. He raised his hand. Elena turned her head away, fixing her eyes on a dark stain on the far wall. She did not want to see. She did not need to see. A single muffled sound echoed in the vast, empty space. It was not loud, but it was terribly final. It was the sound of a period at the end of a very long, very bloody sentence. When she looked back, Gallo was on the ground. He was no longer a threat. He was no longer anything. The garage fell silent. The blinding headlights clicked off one by one, plunging the space back into a dim, gray twilight. The only sounds were the faint hum of the ventilation and that same steady drip of water from the pipe overhead. It was over. The echoes of the conflict hung in the air, heavy and metallic. Julian's men began to disperse silently, efficiently, fading back into the shadows they had come from. Julian stood alone for a moment in the center of the garage, a solitary figure in the gloom. Then he turned and started walking toward her. His face was grim, a mask of exhaustion and grim duty. The ruthless leader was back in place, but she could see the cracks in the facade. He walked until he was standing right in front of her, so close she could feel the heat coming off of him. He smelled of cordite in the cold night air. He slowly raised a hand, reaching for her. She watched it come, expecting to flinch, to pull back out of instinct. But she didn't. She stood her ground as his fingers brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch unexpectedly steady. The echo of the conflict lingered in the cold concrete of the parking garage, a ghost of sound that followed them into the silent elevator. Julian's hand was a firm, steady pressure on Elena's arm, an anchor in the dizzying aftermath. She didn't flinch from his touch. She leaned into it, drawing strength from his stillness as the metal box ascended through the heart of the tower. Back inside the penthouse, the air was sharp with the sterile scent of antiseptic. The chaos was gone, replaced by an unsettling, orderly quiet. Men she had never seen before moved with grim efficiency, their faces blank, their movements economical. They were erasing the violence, wiping away the bloodstains and patching the bullet holes in the walls, as if they were tidying up after a careless party. But Elena could still see it all. The memory was a phantom limb, an ache where the trauma had been. She saw the shattered glass on the floor, the splintered wood of a door frame, the dark stain on the marble where Leo had fallen. She could still feel the phantom weight of her hands pressed against his wound, the slick warmth of his blood, the frantic, useless pressure she had applied. She had lived her entire life as a victim, a creature of flight and fear. But in that garage, watching her father weep and bargain, something inside her had settled. It was not triumph, it was a cold, hard clarity. She had not asked for vengeance. She had simply asked for the noise to stop. Julian led her past the living area and down a quiet white corridor she had never been down before. It ended at a heavy, soundproof door. He paused, his gray eyes searching her face. He seemed to be looking for cracks, for the first sign that she might shatter. She met his gaze, her own eyes dry and weary. The tears had burned out hours ago. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and pushed the door open. The room beyond was not a bedroom, but a private, fully equipped medical suite. The rhythmic, gentle beep of a heart monitor was the only sound. Leo was lying in the center of the room, propped up against a stack of white pillows. He was pale, a network of tubes and wires connecting him to the silent machines around him. A thick bandage was wrapped around his torso, but his eyes were open. They were clear, and they were fixed on the doorway. As Elena stepped inside, his gaze shifted from Julian to her. For a moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with everything that had happened. Leo, the man who had seen her as a weakness, a fatal flaw in Julian's armor. The man who had warned that she would get them all killed. The man who had thrown himself in front of a bullet meant for her. Elena's throat felt tight. She took a hesitant step forward, her hands twisting in front of her. She had expected resentment, or perhaps a cold professional indifference. She had prepared herself for his blame. But Leo's expression held neither. There was a weariness there, a deep, bone-settled exhaustion. But beneath it, there was something else, something new. He slowly, deliberately, lifted his head from the pillow and gave her a single sharp nod. It was not a greeting, it was an acknowledgement, a treaty signed without a single word. It was respect. In that small gesture, Elena felt the final wall of the cage she'd been in begin to crumble. She was no longer just the girl Julian had saved. She was not the liability. She was the woman Leo had protected. A small, shaky breath escaped her lips, and she gave a nod in return. A weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying lifted from her shoulders. Julian's hand found the small of her back, a silent signal that it was time to leave. As they stepped back into the corridor, closing the door on the quiet beeping of the monitor, Elena felt a profound shift. She had not just survived, she had been accepted. The next few days passed in a haze of quiet consolidation. The unseen army that served the Thorn Empire had moved with brutal precision. Marcus Gallo's organization was dismantled from the top down, its power structure collapsing into a void that Julian's people quickly filled. There was no news of her father, Richard Vance. Elena didn't ask, and Julian didn't offer any information. She found she did not want to know. His chapter was closed. The book of her old life finally shut and locked away. The thought brought not relief, but a hollow emptiness. He was her father, and she felt nothing but the absence of fear. It was a strange and lonely kind of freedom. She spent her time in the vast, silent penthouse, wandering from room to room. The staff treated her with a new, quiet deference. She was no longer a guest or a prisoner. She was something else entirely, a figure whose place in this dangerous world was now cemented. She visited Leo every day. Their conversations were brief. He would ask if she was sleeping. She would ask if his pain was manageable. He was recovering quickly, his stubborn strength reasserting itself. The professional distance was still there, but the suspicion in his eyes was gone, replaced by a shared understanding. They were both survivors of the same storm. On the third morning, Elena woke before the sun. The silence of the penthouse felt different, less like a sterile vacuum and more like a held breath. She slipped out of bed, pulling on a soft cashmere sweater that had been left for her. Drawn by an instinct she didn't understand, she made her way to the hidden door that led to the rooftop garden. The air inside was cool and damp, rich with the smell of wet earth and night-blooming jasmine. It was a pocket of impossible life, thriving hundreds of feet above the city streets. She walked along the stone path, her bare feet cold against the smooth rock. The leaves of the plants were beaded with dew, glittering like tiny jewels in the pre-dawn gloom. This was where she had first seen a glimpse of the man behind the mask, the place where they had spoken of their mothers, a shared, fragile moment of humanity. It felt like a lifetime ago. She reached the edge of the garden, a low stone wall that overlooked the sprawling city. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, just beginning to soften to gray at the horizon. The endless grid of streets below was a river of darkness, punctuated by the lonely gold of streetlights and the occasional sweep of headlights. She rested her hands on the cool stone, breathing in the clean air. She felt scoured clean, hollowed out by the violence and the fear, but she was still standing. A soft sound behind her made her turn. Julian was there, standing at the entrance to the garden. He was not wearing one of his immaculate suits, but dark trousers and a simple gray Henley that clung to his broad shoulders. He looked younger without the armor of his professional life. His hair was slightly disheveled, and his face, stripped of its usual guarded mask, looked tired. But his eyes, as always, were fixed on her. He didn't speak, just watched her for a long moment, as if reassuring himself that she was real. Then, he walked slowly toward her, his footsteps nearly silent on the path. He stopped beside her at the wall, following her gaze out over the waking city. They stood in silence as the first sliver of the sun breached the horizon, painting the edges of the clouds in fiery orange and soft pink. The light crept across the sky, chasing the shadows from the canyons between the skyscrapers. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, a world of sharp edges and cold glass, now softened by the dawn. Elena felt a tremor run through her, a delayed reaction to everything she had endured. Her fingers tightened on the stone wall. Then she felt his hand cover hers. His touch was warm and firm, his large hand completely enveloping her own. It wasn't a gesture of possession, but of quiet solidarity, a simple, grounding act that said, "I am here." She didn't pull away. She relaxed her fingers, letting her hand rest in his. His thumb stroked gently over her knuckles, a small, repetitive motion that soothed the frantic beating of her heart. She could feel the faint, rough texture of calluses on his skin, a testament to a life she could barely imagine. Yet in that moment, nothing had ever felt safer. His gaze dropped from the horizon to her face, then lower, to the delicate silver chain around her neck. Her hand instinctively went to it, her fingers closing around the worn shape of the St. Christopher's medallion. It was the one piece of her past she had clung to, the symbol of a desperate prayer for protection. A prayer that, in the strangest way imaginable, had been answered in a dark alley by the most dangerous man she had ever met. Julian slowly lifted his other hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gray eyes asking a silent question. Elena didn't move. She didn't even breathe. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing against her throat as he touched the medallion. His touch was incredibly careful, almost reverent, as his thumb traced the faded image of the saint. It was the same way he had touched the cut on her cheek that first night, a moment of unexpected tenderness that had planted the first seed of trust. He was touching the very core of her fear and her hope, acknowledging the journey that had brought her from that dark alley to this rooftop sunrise. He looked from the medallion back to her eyes. The entire city was coming to life below them, the hum of traffic a distant roar, but up here in their pocket of impossible green, the world seemed to hold its breath. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and quiet, meant only for her. "You're safe, Elena." It was not a command or a statement of fact. It was a vow, the fulfillment of the promise he had made with his body when he shielded her from bullets, with his rage when he hunted down their enemies, and with his presence now as the sun rose on a new day. All the fear, all the tension, all the brittle strength that had held her together for so long finally gave way. A single tear traced a hot path down her cold cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow or fear. It was a tear of release. She turned into him, her body moving without a conscious thought. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough fabric of his shirt soft against her cheek. She closed her eyes, breathing in his scent, a mixture of clean soap and something that was uniquely him. His arm came around her, pulling her close against his side, his hand still covering hers on the stone wall. They stood there together, two damaged people who had found an unlikely anchor in one another. He was her protector, the monster who kept the other monsters at bay. And she was his weakness, the one crack in his armor that had, paradoxically, become his greatest strength. The sun climbed higher, flooding the garden with warm golden light. The world below was still dangerous. The shadows were still long and deep. But as they stood together, watching the dawn of their new, uncertain life, they were not facing it alone. What would you have done? One line in the comments. Let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.